Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take the hardest, most complex, most consequential information you throw at us, we cut through the noise, and we give you a clear map of what truly matters.
And today we are diving deep into a topic that is reshaping international law and strategy in real time. We are confronting the debate over lethal autonomous weapons systems or law WS.
And this isn't science fiction anymore, is it?
Not at all. This is a policy decision that is defining the future of war, right now.
The source material we have for this dive is, it's really powerful because it gives us a structured synthesis of a formal debate. The specific proposition being, should autonomous weapons be banned internationally?
Yeah, and I like that format. It forces everyone to put their cards on the table.
It does. It forces both sides to lay out their foundational assumptions and their best evidence, which lets us see exactly where the real disagreement is.
So our mission today is really to illuminate those foundational assumptions. We need to get past the headlines.
Right. The simple robots shouldn't kill versus robots are inevitable arguments.
Exactly. We need to understand the deep ethical and strategic bets being made by thoughtful people on both sides. Why do smart, ethically driven individuals look at the same exact technology and come to, radically opposing conclusions?
That is the heart of this deep dive.
It really is.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we even get to the fight, the pro-ban versus con-ban arguments, the source material wisely starts by acknowledging the critical points of agreement.
Which is so important because for an issue this urgent, it's crucial to know that the advocates are starting from a place of shared concern. They're not talking past each other on the basics.
And the consensus is surprisingly broad on the risks, isn't it?
It truly is. Both sides fully acknowledge that this is not just some straightforward technical upgrade.
It's not just a faster plane or a better missile?
No, not at all. Law WS introduced genuine systemic risks. Risks regarding accountability, the potential for rapid, uncontrollable escalation, and, massive unintended consequences on the battlefield.
So nobody's arguing this is a risk-free development.
Absolutely nobody. The debate isn't about if there are risks, it's about how to manage them.
And crucially, both sides also acknowledge the intense competitive pressure. We are, for all intents and purposes, in a strategic race.
A fierce one. Nations are hugely incentivized to develop systems that are faster, cheaper, more precise.
So the argument isn't about whether this pressure exists.
No, the argument is whether that overwhelming strategic gravity can be successfully managed through regulation, or if it's so powerful that it demands total prohibition. That's the fork in the road.
They also share a recognition of the technical obstacles. I found this part fascinating. Specifically, what is often termed the black box problem in advanced AI.
Right, the black box. The idea that when you have a complex neural network, even its own developers can struggle to fully explain or predict its behavior in new situations.
So you can see the input, you can see the output, but the process in the middle is opaque.
It can be, yeah. And both sides agree that this presents a profound challenge to verification and trust. They just draw completely different conclusions about whether that problem is, solvable.
And the final shared point, the ethical starting line, is that everyone agrees that human dignity and international humanitarian law, the laws of war, must be protected.
That's the baseline. The clash is purely over the mechanism. What is the best path to protection? Is it a bright line prohibition, a total ban?
Or is it robust, adaptable regulation?
So you have two groups, both highly motivated to ensure a stable and ethical future, who see two completely different strategic outcomes from the exact same technology.
That sets the stage perfectly for Section 1. The case for prohibition, built on, moral and preventative grounds.
Let's get into it.
So let's start with the pro-ban advocates. Their core thesis is fundamentally based on prevention. They argue that a ban is not merely an option, but a moral and strategic imperative required right now.
Before it's too late.
Before it's too late. To prevent an arms race and maintain what they call meaningful human control over lethal force.
And they start with the moral core of the issue, what they call the unacceptable accountability gap. This is probably their most potent legal argument, and it comes directly from the requirements of international humanitarian law, or IHL.
When a machine autonomously decides to kill, it breaks that critical chain of human responsibility. But I want to dig into why that chain is so critical, legally speaking.
Okay, so IHL demands a few key things, but let's focus on two. discrimination and proportionality.
Discrimination being the ability to distinguish combatants from civilians.
Right. And proportionality is ensuring that any expected military advantage outweighs the expected incidental harm to civilians or civilian property. These aren't just calculations, they are judgments.
Judgments made by a human commander or soldier.
Exactly. And crucially, IHL also requires mens rea guilty mind, or intent for criminal culpability. To hold someone accountable for a war crime, you have to prove intent.
Okay, so if a human soldier makes an error in judgment, say, they misidentify a civilian vehicle as a military one and fire on it, that error can be judged.
It can be investigated. You can judge it based on their intent, their training, the circumstances they faced. Was it a reasonable mistake under pressure, or was it criminal negligence?
Oh, wow.
Or worse, was it intentional?
And there's a clear human agent who is legally and morally culpable for that unlawful killing.
There is. But if an autonomous system makes that exact same mistake, the chain just dust. It shatters.
How so? Who do you blame?
Well, that's the question. You cannot assign mens rea to a piece of code. The machine can't possess a guilty mind.
So you go after the programmer.
The programmer will argue they followed best practices, used all the approved data, and the error only happened because of some novel, unpredicted input on the battlefield.
Okay, so the commander who deployed it.
The commander will argue they were out of the loop, relying on the system's guaranteed autonomy to act faster than they ever could. They'll say they trusted the certification process.
And the result is impunity.
It's legal and moral impunity for an unlawful act of war. The system creates a gap where responsibility used to be.
The proban assumption underpinning all of this is, I think, really important. They assume that current and foreseeable AI fundamentally lacks the capacity for genuine human judgment.
It lacks that essential moral reasoning, that contextual understanding, the empathy needed to navigate the nuances of IHL.
So a machine can apply targeting criteria if X, then Y, but it can't exercise human discretion in these morally ambiguous, incredibly complex scenarios.
It can't understand the meaning of surrender from a gesture or hesitate when seeing a child's toy next to a potential target. It lacks wisdom.
And this feeds directly into their second major argument, the risk of global instability and escalation. They call it the flash war risk.
This is the strategic pillar of their case. The moment you remove the human from the decision loop, conflict becomes, in a way, easier to start.
Why is that?
Because there's no immediate human cost for the aggressor, no soldier's life to risk on the front line. And that means the political risk of initiating a conflict decreases dramatically.
It lowers the psychological and political threshold for war.
It does. And once that threshold is crossed, the nature of the conflict changes entirely because of one factor: speed.
This is where they bring up that interesting analogy to nuclear weapons, but then immediately flip it on its head.
Right. The nuclear analogy, they argue, fails to provide any comfort here. Nuclear deterrence was built on mutually assured destruction.
The consequences were so catastrophic and so certain that it created these extremely high barriers to entry and, paradoxically, a kind of stability.
It forced slow, careful, human-driven decision-making. No one was rushing to push the button.
But the laws are the opposite.
Completely. They invite constant low-level conflict because the immediate catastrophic consequences are less certain. This makes them, in a strange way, more dangerous for global stability.
And the pressure for speed means that the moment two sophisticated autonomous systems face each other, the competitive logic just takes over.
This is the fear of algorithmic competition. You have rival AIs pitted against each other, both designed to optimize for speed and tactical advantage.
So they get locked into this perpetual escalatory spiral.
A spiral that moves much, much faster than any human supervisor can possibly process. I mean, think about the physics of that situation.
Okay.
If a machine can observe a threat, calculate a response, and execute a strike in, say, a few hundred milliseconds.
But a human operator needs several seconds just to register what's happening and approve the action.
That human suddenly becomes a fatal liability. The military incentive to shorten that decision loop, to take the human in the loop and move them on the loop or out of it entirely, will be irresistible.
And that leads directly to the flash war.
Conflict erupting and escalating in the time it takes to blink, before any diplomat can even pick up the phone.
So the proban argument is fundamentally preventative. They look at the structural physics of that competition, that relentless drive for speed, and they just conclude that any regulation demanding human control is an inherently unstable idea.
It's an equilibrium that is, in their view, destined to collapse under the pressure of war.
So the only solution is to eliminate the incentive and the technology entirely.
And that brings us to their final point in this section, which addresses the profound ethical layer, the violation of human dignity.
This argument goes beyond the tactical or strategic concerns. It's about the core nature of being human.
It is. The decision to take a human life is recognized globally as the ultimate moral judgment. It requires discretion, context, a moral reckoning.
Delegating that judgment and the moral weight of it to an algorithm is, in their view, a fundamental affront to the principle of humanity.
It treats human life not as possessing intrinsic value, but as a mere data point, something to be processed, quantified, and terminated based on a line of code.
This crosses an ethical Rubicon. Pro-ban advocates argue that even if autonomous weapons could statistically reduce civilian harm, and we'll get to that claim in a minute, the act of automating the decision to kill degrades the shared moral conscience of humanity.
Exactly. It separates the moral actor, the human, from the ultimate consequence of the action, the killing. And that, they argue, fundamentally undermines the entire purpose of the laws of war.
So for the pro-ban side, it's about the act of delegation itself, not just the outcome.
That's it. For them, some actions are simply off-limits for machines, regardless of any potential efficiency gains.
It is hard to shake that moral weight. It's a powerful argument. But the opposition argues we're looking at the problem from the wrong angle entirely.
A completely different framework.
Let's shift then to the case against prohibition. The con-ban thesis argues that a blanket ban is strategically counterproductive, impossible to enforce, and critically risks increasing harm by constraining only the actors who actually follow the law.
Right. They advocate for managed, regulated development, and they immediately tackle that moral high ground claimed by the pro-ban side.
It's a very counterintuitive claim,
Right.
the potential to reduce civilian harm.
This argument is purely utilitarian. They argue that autonomous systems might, in the long run, actually reduce civilian casualties and war crimes compared to human operators.
How is that possible?
They're focusing on eliminating the specific human failures that drive atrocities. I mean, think about the conditions under which most war crimes happen.
Okay.
They're usually driven by powerful emotional states. Fear, panic, rage, fatigue, a desire for revenge, the cumulative stress of long-term combat.
A machine doesn't have any of those.
It doesn't possess any of those emotional states.
Huh.
A human soldier in a split-second high-stress scenario, especially after seeing a comrade injured, might make a criminally disproportionate decision.
They might lash out.
A machine, however, only has its code. The con-ban position is making a statistical bet that a well-designed, well-tested system will apply targeting criteria, rules of engagement, and proportionality requirements far more consistently and dispassionately than a stressed human ever could.
So they're basically arguing that while algorithms introduce new computational errors, like misclassifying a civilian tractor as a tank,
they eliminate the massive category of human-driven error caused by emotional volatility and moral failure. And in the net outcome, they believe lives will be saved.
Of course, the pro-ban side pushes back on this hard. They say algorithms lack compassion, discretion, the ability to grant a second chance or recognize surrender based on context.
They do. But the con side maintains that perfect judgment isn't the goal. Reducing overall battlefield tragedy is. And if you remove the human element that causes intentional cruelty, you improve the net outcome.
It's a cold calculus.
It is. And it leads us to the strategic heart of their argument, the danger of asymmetry and selective observance. This is their pragmatic strategic vulnerability argument.
A ban, they argue, only constrains the nations already committed to international law.
The good actors, so to speak. Law-abiding nations adhere to the treaty, while adversaries, peer states, or even sophisticated non-state actors develop these systems without any restriction.
Leaving the compliant nations at a severe strategic disadvantage.
A catastrophic one, potentially. And this challenge is fundamentally different from historical arms control, like nuclear non-proliferation.
Why is that?
Because nuclear weapons required massive state infrastructure, rare materials like enriched uranium, and highly specialized facilities. The barriers to entry were incredibly high.
So it was easier to monitor and control.
Much easier. Law Ws, however, rely on commercially available dual-use technology. We're talking about drones you can buy online, open-source AI frameworks, advanced processors. The barrier to entry is extremely low.
If the barriers are that low, a ban becomes almost meaningless for the most concerning actors.
That's the worry. The con side fears a prohibition would just send development into the shadows. And that would mean the only actors developing these world-changing capabilities will be those least constrained by ethical and legal concerns.
So by banning it, you eliminate your own influence, but you don't actually eliminate the threat.
You might even make it worse. And this feeds into a very practical challenge, the problem of definition.
What do we even mean by an autonomous weapon?
Exactly. They argue that it's not a clear, discrete thing, it's a continuous spectrum.
We're talking about everything from, say, automated air defense systems that decide whether to shoot down incoming missiles,
Systems that are already in use by navies around the world?
all the way up to fully offensive, sentient-level systems, which are currently just theoretical. So where do you draw the line in a treaty?
It's nearly impossible. Any treaty definition would either be so narrow that it's strategically useless, banning only systems that no one plans to build anyway,
Or it would be so broad that it bans existing legitimate defensive systems or highly automated functions that are proven to increase safety and are already deployed.
and this practical unenforceability, the con side argues, makes the whole idea of a comprehensive ban an inherently fragile legal concept.
And finally, they directly confront that moral argument we started with by challenging the normative analogy.
Right. They argue that Law WS simply cannot be grouped with previously banned weapons like chemical weapons or anti-personnel landmines.
They make a key distinction about strategic utility.
A huge distinction. Consider chemical weapons. They are fundamentally indiscriminate. They cause agonizing suffering, and they have limited strategic utility compared to precise conventional force.
And certain types of landmines, while devastating, are often of low, localized strategic value to major world powers.
So they were relatively easy to ban because the strategic sacrifice for the big players was low, the moral gain was high, the strategic loss was minimal.
But autonomous weapons are different.
They're the opposite. They offer two things that militaries value above almost all else: precision and decisive speed advantages in dynamic environments. They are perceived as extremely high-utility weapons.
And this is the critical distinction for the con ban argument.
It is. Historically, when the strategic utility of a weapon system is that high normative pressure tends to weaken, often to the point of collapse. They point to instances where nations perceiving existential security needs have defected from arms control agreements.
The argument is, if your adversary gains a decisive advantage through speed and precision, your existential need to match that advantage will always, eventually, trump an early, non-binding moral norm.
So the core of the con ban case is pragmatic. Why constrain your own military with a law that is difficult to define and easy for adversaries to circumvent?
When the only guaranteed result is ceding strategic advantage and losing all influence over the ethical evolution of the technology itself.
That's their case in a nutshell.
That distinction between low-utility weapons like landmines and high-utility weapons like law abuse is a fascinating point. It brings us perfectly to Section 3, where we stop focusing on abstract, moral, and strategic predictions and dive into the detailed exploration of the dueling technical and economic realities.
Right. These are empirical arguments. They're bets on the real-world behavior of technology in global markets.
Let's start with the economic calculus, which presents one of the biggest paradoxes I saw, the arms race versus cost efficiencies argument.
It's a total paradox. The pro-ban position sees the competition as an inevitable, rapid, and qualitatively new arms race.
They predict it will require massive, continuous economic investment. We're talking about computing power, sensor technology, complex software development.
Diverting trillions of dollars potentially from other essential national priorities like healthcare or infrastructure. They see it as a high-stakes, wasteful expenditure that really only benefits defense contractors.
But the con ban side counters with a cold, hard efficiency argument. They say autonomous systems can dramatically reduce the long-term economic burden of defense.
And this isn't just about the unit cost of a drone versus a fighter jet. It's about the entire human capital supply chain.
And they cite truly staggering figures to illustrate this point. Consider our human defense assets. The source material references the lifetime cost of training and maintaining a single F-35 pilot.
And that cost exceeds $10 million.
That's completely separate from the $100 million plus cost of the aircraft itself.
Right. That $10 million is the recurring human capital expense. It's recruitment, years of intensive flight training, decades of salary, healthcare, pensions, family support, continuous certification just to maintain combat readiness.
It's an enormous investment in one person.
A huge one. And autonomous systems over time and at scale, they eliminate those human capital expenses entirely. You replace a fragile, expensive human pilot who requires continuous support with software that can be replicated and updated globally for a fraction of the cost.
But the efficiency goes far beyond just pilots.
Oh, absolutely. Think about logistics and ground crew. Autonomous systems reduce the risk to ground personnel. They limit the exposure of sensitive supply lines because you just need fewer forward-deployed people to manage the operations.
They also allow for the use of cheaper, more expendable hardware in certain roles.
Exactly, reducing the pressure to save every single high-value asset. So one side sees an inevitable, wasteful, escalating competition, while the other side sees a long-term fiscal necessity.
A way for future defense budgets to maintain parity with adversaries while reducing the most volatile and expensive asset, the human being.
It is a staggering contrast in predictive economic modeling.
It really is. Now we move to the central technical clash that underpins everything. Verification and the black box problem.
The Proban case emphasizes the impossibility of verification. As we mentioned, the black box is a known challenge in complex neural networks.
We can see the inputs, we can see the outputs, but we can't reliably trace the millions of algorithmic steps that led to a specific lethal decision.
And if you can't trace the decision, if you can't look inside that black box and understand why the AI chose target A over target B,
You certainly can't verify, test, or certify that the system will reliably adhere to the laws of war when it's exposed to unforeseen chaos or an adversary trying to trick it.
for the Proban advocates, this inherent technical opacity is the absolute nail in the coffin for any regulatory approach. You simply cannot regulate what you cannot audit.
But the Kanban side argues back robustly. Technical challenges argue for design standards, not prohibition. This is where they introduce the concept of explainable AI.
XAI. This is the big technical wager being made by the Kanban side.
And they reference significant specific investment, pointing to organizations like DARPA, whose XAI program has been running since 2017.
With the explicit goal of developing AI systems whose decisions can be understood, audited, and explained to a human supervisor, this isn't a theoretical fantasy, it's directed, funded research.
So the con side argues that the inability to explain a decision is a temporary technical hurdle, not a permanent theoretical constraint.
Right. They believe that if we mandate rigorous development standards, standards that require XAI integration before any system is deployed, then the black box can eventually be cracked open sufficiently for legal compliance and accountability.
And they draw the powerful aviation analogy.
This is a key part of their argument. They point out that modern society successfully governs highly complex, partially automated systems like the commercial autopilot in passenger jets.
These are systems that make life and death decisions all the time.
Every day. And they do so under rigorous certification and testing standards that ensure safety and predictability.
So their question is, if we can successfully govern and certify systems that manage highly complex, consequential decisions in the air, why can't we do the same for systems operating on the battlefield?
The solution isn't to ban airplanes. The solution is to impose rigorous certification standards that demand safety and accountability.
But hold on, I remember the pro-ban advocate immediately pushing back strongly on that analogy. What is the fundamental difference between commercial aviation and the battlefield that makes that analogy fall apart for them?
The difference is the environment.
It's not a sterile, controlled environment.
Not at all. Aviation operates in a highly structured, regulated, and largely predictable environment governed by the consistent laws of physics. The battlefield, conversely, is fundamentally chaotic, high-stress, and most critically adversarial.
Adversarial, that's the key word.
It's everything. Adversaries are actively trying to fool your systems. They are engaging in sensor deception, using decoys, injecting false signals, exploiting latent vulnerabilities in the AI's logic that you didn't even know existed.
So no pre-deployment test regime, no matter how rigorous, can adequately simulate the novelty and chaos introduced by a determined, intelligent human adversary.
The system might perform perfectly in the lab a million times, but then collapse the first time its sensors are tricked in a dynamic combat situation.
So the clash here is profound. Is the verification challenge a technological hurdle that XAI will eventually solve over time? That's the Kanban bet.
Or is the adversarial, chaotic nature of war an inherent permanent limitation that makes high-stakes, real-time verification fundamentally impossible? That's the Proban assertion.
That leaves us with the final major technical area, proliferation risk. Both sides agree proliferation is easy, but they draw completely opposite policy conclusions from that shared fact.
Which is fascinating. The pro-ban side fears that the software-based nature of AI makes autonomous capabilities incredibly easy to copy and proliferate.
It dramatically lowers the global barrier to entry,
It does. And they bring up the analogy of sophisticated cyber weapons.
like the NSA's Eternal Blue exploit.
Exactly. Once that was stolen and released into the wild, it was immediately repurposed and used globally by everyone from state actors to criminal organizations.
Because software, unlike enriched uranium, spreads easily, quickly, and often without any physical tracking mechanisms.
The pro-ban argument suggests that a sophisticated law cell algorithm will follow the exact same path. Once it's out there for everyone.
The con-ban argument accepts this low barrier, but uses it to argue that a ban is therefore rendered completely ineffective.
They contrast laws with nuclear weapons again, which required those rare materials and specialized facilities, and point out that lotteries require primarily software expertise and commercially available chips.
And this is where they bring in specific, real-world evidence of proliferation already happening right now, completely undermining the preventative goal of a ban.
They reference the Turkish Kargu 2 drone, which was reportedly operating autonomously in Libya back in 2020.
And this is significant because the Kargu 2 isn't some massive, custom-built strategic system.
No, it's a cheap, commercially derived quadcopter platform integrated with AI. This single example demonstrates that autonomous capability is already spreading rapidly beyond major powers, using readily available dual-use technology.
So if the technology is already spreading through commercially available parts and easily copied software, if the barn door is already wide open,
Then a ban, the con-ban side contends, won't stop proliferation. It will only constrain the powerful nations who are most likely to develop the technology ethically, while the less scrupulous actors gain an uncontested, low-cost advantage.
that detailed look at the evidence brings us to the meta level. We've laid out the moral, the strategic, the technical, and the economic arguments, which are essentially two complex, self-consistent worldviews.
Yeah, two completely different ways of looking at the future.
So now we need to synthesize what the source material identified as the three core disagreements, the three foundational bets where the future really hinges.
Disagreement number one is the most central, I think, the stability of regulatory frameworks. This is the core wager about human nature and competitive pressure.
The pro-ban side makes the powerful predictive claim that meaningful human control is an unstable equilibrium. It's destined to collapse.
And their prediction is based entirely on the overwhelming competitive pressure to reduce latency to get faster.
The need for microseconds of advantage over a rival AI will, in their view, inevitably override any existing legal or moral constraint.
They predict that competitive logic, military necessity, and the simple fear of being too slow will always trump ethical protocols. Oversight will gradually erode. It'll become a symbolic rubber stamp before, finally, full autonomy is adopted.
But the con-ban position argues that this competitive pressure can and must be managed.
Right. Through robust regulation, transparency, and enforcement. They see this as a problem of institutional design, not as some insurmountable existential threat.
Their argument is that we manage competitive pressures in high-stakes fields all the time.
All the time. In aviation safety, in financial markets, in nuclear power. You have fields where the rules constrain action, but the industry still operates effectively.
So the key is to design the rules correctly and make the penalties for defection severe enough to maintain compliance.
So the question hinges entirely on whether you believe institutional design can withstand that overwhelming competitive pressure under the chaotic existential logic of wartime.
The pro side says history shows competitive logic always wins. The con side says robust frameworks can be successfully implemented if we have the will.
Disagreement number two concerns the effectiveness of early normative prohibition. This pits the preventative approach against the adaptive approach.
The pro-ban view is fundamentally preventative. A clear ban established now before the technology is widely deployed and normalized creates a powerful normative barrier.
A stigma.
A stigma. It raises the political, the diplomatic, and the economic costs of defection before the technology becomes seen as militarily decisive and therefore irresistible.
They want to establish the norm while the strategic utility is still being debated. The goal is to make it politically toxic for a major power to cross that line in the first place.
They prioritize setting a clear, unambiguous ethical standard immediately.
But the con-ban view is adaptive. They argue that high strategic utility will always overwhelm early norms, And they cite the failure of past attempts to stop the proliferation of high-value technologies.
Their argument is that a ban actually excludes law-abiding nations from shaping the technology's evolution.
Exactly. If you leave the negotiating table, if you ban it for yourself, you cede all influence over the standards, the ethics, and the verification protocols to the unconstrained actors who are going to develop it anyway.
So it's a choice between setting a rigid ethical ideal that might just be ignored by those who matter most.
Which is the pro-ban approach, or staying engaged to steer the messy, inevitable reality of technological development, which is the con-ban approach.
Finally, disagreement number 3, the value of engagement versus exclusion.
The pro-ban side favors exclusion precisely because it creates that clear, unambiguous, bright line.
A total ban means any detected development is a high-stakes, discrete political decision. It's a clear violation.
And that clarity makes detection, condemnation, and diplomatic action much, much easier than trying to monitor compliance on a vague, technologically nuanced, slippery slope of different regulations.
But monitoring a regulated environment is exactly what the con-ban side advocates for. They want engagement.
They argue that regulated development keeps the compliant nations at the table to shape ethical standards and verification protocols.
Their argument is that because the technology is likely to develop regardless of a ban, engagement is the only necessary tool to maintain influence.
To ensure that any development, even by compliant nations, adheres to the highest possible ethical and safety standards that can be achieved.
So the choice comes down to which type of risk you are more willing to accept.
The risk of moral compromise in the hope of steering development, which is the con-ban position, or the risk of strategic vulnerability and black market proliferation in the name of a clear moral principle, which is the pro-ban position.
It is clear that the ultimate policy choice hinges entirely on these empirical and predictive questions that are still unresolved. Can XAI mature fast enough to solve the black docs?
Can human control genuinely survive competitive speed demands when microseconds matter? And what exactly constitutes a decisive strategic advantage that would compel a nation to defect from a treaty?
There's profound, genuine uncertainty inherent in this decision, and both sides, to their credit, acknowledge that they're making high-stakes wagers on the future character of conflict.
They absolutely do.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've seen the two primary policy alternatives laid out. The preventative, bright-line ban, which bets on the power of early norms and the fragility of human oversight.
Versus the regulated, engagement-based approach, which bets on the solvency of technical design standards and the high strategic cost of self-constraint.
The source material details this immense pressure for speed. The entire architecture of future conflict seems to favor the entity that can observe, decide, and act faster than human reaction time.
Everything is pushing towards removing latency, and the biggest source of latency is the human brain.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The question for you to consider, building on the strategic tension exposed by this debate, is this. If a human supervisor who requires several seconds to process information and approve a decision is truly a fatal liability in a future conflict defined by algorithmic speed,
Does that mean the moral imperative to protect human life through human control must be sacrificed to the strategic imperative of machine speed?
or, conversely, is the strategic cost of being slower? The cost of preserving that critical human in the loop, even if it introduces the potential for human error and human emotion. Is that cost worth paying to uphold the sanctity of human dignity and maintain moral accountability in the future of warfare?
That is the ultimate wager on the character of humanity itself.